Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library's AADL TV YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in for tonight's Bright Nights Community Forum, where Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson will discuss the Embrace Intervention Strategy for talking about race with youth. In just a moment, Stephanie Salazar of the University of Michigan Depression Center will introduce our guest. If you enjoy this program, don't forget to click like down below and follow our channel for more AADL programming. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Tonight we have the pleasure of having Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. She uses mixed methods in clinical interventions to study racial discrimination and socialization in Black families to reduce racial stress and trauma and provide psychological well-being and family functioning. She's particularly interested in how these factors predict familial functioning and subsequent child psychosocial well-being and health-related behaviors when enrolled in family-based interventions. Dr. Anderson is the developer and director of the Embrace. Is that right, Dr. Anderson?
Embrace.
Engaging, managing, and bonding through race intervention, and loves to translate her work for a variety of audiences, particularly those whom she serves in the community via blogs, video, and literary articles. Finally, Dr. Anderson was born in, raised for, and returned to Detroit and is becoming increasingly addicted to cake pops. Thank you for being here, Dr. Anderson. So just to let you know, she's going to give a little bit of an overview, and then we'll do some questions that we commonly get. So welcome, Dr. Anderson.
All right, can we see that screen? I think so, I hope so. All right, so today we're going to talk about moving the talk to the walk, talking about race with youth. A lot of talks in there, but we're going to get it. All right, Dr. Evelyn Hammonds of Harvard University said there has never been any period in American history where the health of Blacks was equal to that of whites. Disparity is built into the system. And I like to describe that for those folks who are not familiar with my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. So I'm gonna just read a little bit, so forgive my eyes kind of darting away, but I was born and raised in the city, and as the biracial child of Black and Greek parents, learned early on about the racial dynamics and the racial divide between my family and ecological and historical dynamics shaping Detroit. After many veterans returned from World War II, a surge in home ownership led many families to seek housing in the greater metropolitan Detroit area. The Federal Housing Authority, or the FHA, denied mortgages to aspiring white homeowners within a neighborhood because it was deemed too close to Black homeowners within Detroit. Thus, in 1941, a wall, as you see in front of you, was erected to divide the north and south sides of 8 Mile, that is the suburbs from Detroit proper, to separate the white homeowners from their Black counterparts. This early example of the policy of redlining, or refusing mortgages due to financial risk, shaped the way in which Detroit residents could access homes and the resources associated with their property. With some documented discriminatory practices continuing well into the 1960s, over 25% of all homes that are currently in Metro Detroit were constructed during this redlining period. So if a child were born south of 8 Mile in Detroit during this time, she had a 62% likelihood of growing up in poverty, relative to 4% of her white counterparts on the north side over the wall. Likewise, her children had a 66% chance of growing up in poverty, this generational poverty, right? Relative to 6% of her white peers. So you're seeing this structured generational poverty or wealth over the division of this wall. And those fiscal differences equated to lived disparities over the wall. So impoverished Black residents had IQ scores that were 10 points less on average if they're living in poor neighborhoods with specific deficits in math and reading. They were also more likely to indicate feeling distressed and depressed than their white peers and had a greater likelihood of being obese. Although beautiful mural artwork now adorns the wall and FHA policies no longer allow race to be an explicit factor in loans, the effects from these policies are enduring and stark. The de facto segregation currently yields an 83% Black population south of 8 Mile in Detroit, and leading the nation in concentrated poverty with 39% of residents below the poverty threshold. In contrast, north of 8 Mile, Oakland County is 78% white and the richest county in the state. So why even give a background about that? So if folks are in Ann Arbor, it's 45 or 35 miles away, depending on where you are. Why would you care about what's going on in Detroit? Well, Detroit is one of many cities that share a rich history of urban processes and policies that have allowed racial discrimination to exist for decades, generations within the United States. So racial discrimination means the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. We know that at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 years old indicate having at least one incident of racial discrimination per year. And in fact, some of these daily numbers that we're starting to see look closer to 5+ incidents a day, given things like social media, the advent of social media that has brought some situations into the hands, literally, of some children in ways that it never would have before. So we're seeing some of these numbers skyrocket, particularly in these daily experiences. The reasons that we're getting 5+ or 90%, these types of high numbers, is because discrimination types and experiences differ. So in vivo, if it's happening to me in real time, and vicarious, if I'm seeing it on my smartphone happening to someone else, those are two of the ways that it might occur. Objective, so I know for sure that this cross burning is something that is objectively racist, versus subjective, more microaggressions. This person clutched their purse, they walked across the street. Was it about my race? Those are the things that might lead up to such a large number. And then the various levels. So we already talked about some of the systemic policies through redlining in Detroit, but these can be interpersonal, so things that are being said between individuals. It can be institutional, what a university or what perhaps a golf course has done at some point. But there are lots of levels and lots of strategies that discrimination can rear its ugly head. I wanted to show you something that I've done in my research before, which shows just how pernicious racial discrimination is. So what you're looking at here is what we would call a structural equation model. That's a lot of gobbledygook that essentially means take a look at some of those lines that are going between those boxes and those circles. So the question that we're asking is discrimination indirectly related to later child psychosocial outcomes via maternal depression and parenting? Again, a lot of gobbledygook, but essentially we're saying if we start with this idea of parental discrimination, can that line indirectly, or can it go from discrimination all the way to child internalizing problems through these other things? So if I'm a parent who's discriminated against, will I feel some depression? Will my depression then lead to some undesirable parenting practices? Will those parenting practices negatively impact my child's internalizing, which are things like depression, anxiety, etc.? So in this question that we asked, we found that yes, discrimination can indirectly impact children, which is something that we would expect. That's something that the literature would show from family systems theory. If something happens to a parent, it's likely going to happen to the child, or going to impact the child in some way because of the impact that it has on the parent. Things like their depression, things like their parenting. But what we found next was that there's also a direct relationship. So essentially, we would not expect that something that happens to the parent, if a parent reports having a great amount of discrimination, why would their children say that they are depressed, that they are anxious, if not for things like their parents' depression, their parents' parenting practices? So the second finding that we are showing here is really counter to some of the things that the regular parenting literature might say is an explanatory reason why children would be so frustrated. It's because children are not missing what's going on in the world, and you'll see a bit of that in just a moment. So I always like to show this slide because I think some people think racial discrimination might be associated with just a few outcomes for kids. So we just talked about one that was internalizing, again, stuff like depression or anxiety. But I really want to just show you the gravity of how many things racial discrimination is associated with in children. So if you took the same model that I just showed you and replaced that last variable, the child internalizing, with any of these things, you're going to find some significant relationships between discrimination, whether it's their own or something that their parent or within the community. You're going to find that these outcomes are associated with racial discrimination for children. Now, stress and trauma is my bread and butter, so we're going to talk a bit about that in the presentation today. So what do I mean by stress and trauma? We're looking at symptoms as a consequence of emotional pain during and or after discrimination. So again, these same types of outcomes that are related to discrimination directly can manifest into stress and trauma later on. So academic or cognitive, I might be ruminating about something. I might be hypervigilant, waiting for this thing to occur. Psychologically, I might experience a greater amount of depression or anxiety because I am not settled with this occurrence, or like I'm fearing that it might happen again. And physiologically, my heart rate might increase, my foot might be tapping. There are a number of things that I'm not settled about given this discriminatory experience. And that again is because discrimination is not a one-time occurrence. It's not something that people think it's one and done. It is something that people are anticipating happening frequently. And in fact, again, the data is showing it is happening more and more frequently in the lives of a lot of youth. So I can talk to you all day about what this looks like or feels like for me, but I love AJ to tell his story about it himself. So take a listen to what AJ is describing about his experience of racial stress and trauma. And I want you to, in your mind, think about what it is that you're hearing AJ say, what you're seeing AJ express, and what it is that you feel when you're listening to AJ.
So what are the problems that we're facing today?
Oh, racism. Cops killing black people. Just like, mostly about like racist. Like, cops is killing black people, and the cops that kill black people is white.
Okay.
You ever notice that?
So what do you think that means? Like, expand on that for me. Talk to me about that.
So what do I mean about that? Like, the black people don't like, the white people don't like the black people. So like, the cops is like trying to get rid of the black people faster, so they can live longer, but they just trying to get rid of them.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know.
How does it feel when you see things like that?
It hurts.
Okay, so if we were together, we'd be doing a lot of processing about what it is that you saw, felt, or heard from AJ, but you could hear at the end him saying it hurts. So you're literally seeing what it is that figure that I showed you was describing. What it is that's going on in his neighborhood and his community is hurting him, especially on the inside. That thing hurts him. So that's what racial stress and trauma looks like. That's how discrimination manifests in the livelihood and well-being of Black youth like AJ. One thing that AJ goes on to say is that it hurts and he doesn't quite know how to talk about this thing. It's a really unique thing that he hasn't really had the opportunity or the people in his life to talk about. So we would call that compromised coping. It's because it impairs not only his normal coping processes, so he might use more avoidant strategies to cope, but it's a particular coping strategy. So it's only when we're talking about racially discriminatory behaviors. So I'll give you a quick example. If I know that there's a bully at a corner of a street, I might go to the street over to go to school every day. That's an avoidant strategy. I'm not going to run into that person. I'm not going to face that person. But for people like AJ, the fear and the concern is that these elements could be on every corner. So maybe he's facing discrimination at the corner store. Maybe he's facing it with this police officer. Maybe he's facing it with his teacher. These monsters, these in his mind might be everywhere. So that's increasing his coping capacities to perhaps avoid some of these things that make a lot of sense with the literature. Maybe he wants to avoid some elements of school or avoid talking about these concerns that he has in his body. But what parents try to do to to cope, to help their children cope with these racial events is something that we call racial socialization. And we see that quite a bit, especially after large incidents. So when Jordan Davis was killed in Florida, or Trayvon Martin was killed also in Florida, we're seeing this advice, this talk come out in these spaces where parents feel a need to help their children cope with some of the challenges that are going on in the world with respect to racial discrimination. So again, we would call that racial socialization, which is really just the communication between family about the racial world as a means to better cope with this discriminatory event. There are 4 different strategies that parents often use, including cultural socialization, preparation for bias, promotion of mistrust, egalitarianism or colorblindness. And instead of me, again, blabbing about these things, I would much rather show you a very corny video that my colleague and I have made about racial socialization.
This session is dedicated to the youth who have been killed by discriminatory practices, including
Laquan McDonald,
Tamir Rice,
Ayanna Stanley Jones,
Michael Brown,
Trayvon Martin.
Oh man,
Reed, what's got you worked up today?
man, it's another one of these headlines talking about a young kid killed by a police officer or a dang on vigilante.
Man, I don't know what it would have been like to have race all in our face like that growing up.
You mean like the O.J. Simpson trial or the L.A. riots or Rodney King?
Snap, man. I didn't even think about the fact that young kids can pick up on race like that.
Yeah, I mean, by 3, kids are starting to see differences in race. By 7, they're making meaning of those differences. And by 10, they're starting to think about their own role in that difference.
If only there were a way for parents and children to talk about race effectively.
But there it is. So racial socialization is all about the way that parents teach kids about the racial world around them.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure I follow. What do you mean by the whole socialization thing?
Yeah, well, you know how we tell kids to look both ways before they cross the street or not to talk to strangers, right? So racial socialization is about race specifically. I bet you can even think about a few things that your family's told you about what to do when you were growing up. Think about cultural socialization or pride.
You mean like celebrating Kwanzaa or going to the African American Museum or singing songs like, "Say it loud, woo, I'm black and I'm proud."
Yep, that's it. How about preparation for bias?
You know what? Every time I get in the car, I can hear my mom's advice telling me where to put my hands if I ever get pulled over. 10 and 2.
And yet we've seen plenty of evidence that shows even when we follow these rules in every situation, it doesn't work every time.
Yeah, so what about like when people get upset when things do actually happen?
Well, that's also a type of a socialization, right? So we call that promotion of distrust. It's when stuff happens and we want to pass that distrust down to our kids.
I've heard some people go in the opposite direction. I mean, talking about the fact that race doesn't even matter at all anymore.
Yeah, well, that's our last category, right? So some people call it post-racial, some people call it egalitarianism, but it's all about being equal despite race.
Reed, I mean, that's a ton of strategies. I mean, so which one should we choose?
Yeah, well, the good thing is you don't have to choose just one. Most parents do a blended approach, but it's about the type of blend that makes sense. So preparation for bias and pride messages together typically yield better psychological, academic, and identity outcomes for youth.
So what should we be telling youth who need to know about the world around them?
Well, the good thing is we should be talking to youth, right? So kids are totally observant. They're seeing these headlines. They're not missing it. So we need to be talking to our kids first and foremost. And we need to be providing them, again, with those blended messages, pride and preparation, messages and activities, so that we can let our kids know that being Black is a beautiful thing, even when other people don't think so. I'm Ree.
And I'm CT.
And this is our Mental Health Minute.
You are young, gifted, black. We must begin to tell our young.
Okay, so essentially,
This session.
sorry about that. Essentially what it is that our group is trying to do is to say, you just learned about those 4 different strategies, and typically we think about it as the quantity. So how frequently do you socialize your child with cultural messages or prepare them for bias? But the way that our team is looking at it is, well, how well do you do it? What's the quality of those processes? So I'm not going to bore you with these details, but essentially, can we reduce stress? Can we improve the skills that parents have when they're giving the talk? And can we improve confidence? Because let's be honest, it's a scary endeavor trying to keep your kids safe, imagining what is going on in the racial world around them. So we're trying to prepare parents for having the talk with their kids. Yes, the talk itself is important, but preparing for that talk and doing a good job of it is also quite important. So that's what our group is looking at. One of the ways that we are indicating, if you think about what our work has done before with how racial discrimination has related to some child outcomes, then we're trying to put all the elements that we've talked about today within a theory to make it a bit more clear for people how this works. So the long story short is that we've got a stress and coping framework here where we're saying racial discrimination leads to racial stress. So you heard that with AJ, he gets stressed out. He doesn't quite know what to do. That's him racially having challenge with racial coping. And some of those outcomes that we would predict as a result of him not quite knowing what to do and being hurt about this is to have something like higher depression or higher anxiety as an outcome. What we're arguing is that if we take this racial socialization competency that we just talked about, so again, the quality of having the talk with your kids, if we're able to think about that as something that moderates or modulates, so if you think about it as a seesaw, right? Something that moderates or modulates helps to tip the balance a bit. So we know that discrimination can cause a lot of challenging things, but if you have competency, can you tip the balance of discrimination having a really steep impact on these outcomes to maybe not having any impact at all, right? To flattening it out. We think that we can do that. We can improve the competency of parents, and that helps children feel more efficacious. So now I know some different strategies to handle the challenges that I have. Now I know that I don't have to just avoid, I don't have to go around the corner to avoid this monster. If there are things that I can do in person, I can talk to this person, I can have my parents come in on my behalf, I can organize, I can protest. There are a number of things that I can do, but I believe in myself to do them. That's self-efficacy. And then I actually execute that. That's the coping itself. And if I'm more efficacious, if I actually do something that makes me feel better, more absolved of this racial stress, then my outcomes would be better. So that's the racial encounter coping, appraisal, and socialization theory, taking all the things that we've discussed together. My colleague and I indicate that we expect that this theory will predict how well African American youth can critically and consciously reappraise and resolve racial conflicts by facing and challenging the habitus of expendable Black humanity. So again, in AJ's case, the expendable nature, this racial discrimination, this racial stress, the Black features, the things that are protective from a cultural standpoint, the racial socialization competency, and the belief that children can actually do something about this racial world that they're living in, and these humanity perspectives. So can I cope? Can I do something about it? And do I have wellness? Am I okay at the end of this experience, which we know is going to happen? Not if it happens, but we know it's going to happen. So is my humanity intact and affirmed if I'm engaging in these protective Black mechanisms against these expendable constructs like discrimination? Our job then is to think about how to intervene between, again, these things that can directly impact the well-being of children. So again, discrimination can directly impact child psychological wellness. How do we intervene between it? So at this point, we know the problem, it's discrimination. We've got a theory recast that we just talked about. The question for so long has been, well, why won't someone do something about it? That's me when my hair is straight and long, and I'm here, I have something to do about it. So I'm gonna quickly talk to you about Embrace, which is a strategy that we use. It stands for Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race. And it is a 5-session family-based intervention, or the thing that cuts between discrimination and these negative outcomes, which hopes to increase parent and adolescent socialization competency, or how well we can give the talk to each other. We hope to reduce parent and adolescent racial stress and trauma through self-efficacy and coping, which we just showed you through the recast model. And we also hope to improve adolescent psychological and academic outcomes, a number of outcomes really. Remember those 30 different outcomes that popped up on the screen? We're hoping to reduce a lot of those. Then in some of the work that we're doing in schools of education, in psychological practices, in public health, we're looking for certain key outcomes that we're hoping to reduce. We do this by improving skill development in things like engaging in racial socialization content, managing some of the stressfulness that comes along with these discussions, and I'll talk more about this CLCDE acronym in just a bit, and bonding. So if you have a really challenging conversation, is it easy to talk and to relate to each other at that time? Absolutely not. So we're hoping to improve the ability to bond while having these challenging conversations. So we're the first racial socialization intervention for both adolescents and parents. A lot of people might focus just on parents, but how do we bring the whole family in there? And we seek to do this by providing support for culturally specific theories like recast and evidence-based practices, which we'll share a bit of in a bit, and the interruption of racism as a virus. We're talking a lot about COVID as a virus, but racism in this dual pandemic has also reared itself as a virus that we should be mindful of. So in other words, we're moving the talk to the walk. If you're a Migos fan, then you get this reference. If not, skip right on over it. All right, Embrace has a very similar model, and I'm not gonna spend too much time here because you've already seen a lot of these boxes, but essentially that red, remember those are the expendable elements, the challenging things. We wanna increase our awareness of the stressor. We wanna improve stress management to kind of mitigate those expendable elements. For the Black protective factors, we want to reinforce those protective racial socialization strategies that Dr. Sean Jones and I talked about in our video. We want to improve the parent-child relationship, improve the racial socialization competency, and advance the self-efficacy of youth. And finally, for these humanity elements, we want to target the encouragement of racial assertiveness. So can I cope with what it is that's in front of me when I typically want to avoid? Can I actually face it head on? Can I expand the types of coping strategies that I've even put into my bag to deal with this thing? And those are the types of elements, if we're able to do all these things that we just talked about in Embrace, our belief is that we can eradicate or at least reduce some of these negative outcomes that discrimination yields for Black youth, including things like internalizing or externalizing, which we've talked about a number of times, like depression and anxiety, physiological arousal, the tapping of the foot, what you saw with AJ, the eating of sugary foods, right? These are all elements that are linked back to discrimination. So our hope is to eradicate that. What we've done in the past and what we hope to do in the future when COVID allows us to get back together with folks, and we'll talk about that in a second, is that we have talked with Black 10 to 14-year-olds and their caregivers. We compensate them for their time and energy with us of $100 plus things that the community has provided, like books, t-shirts, etc. We recruit from schools with behavioral service agencies and through social media, word of mouth, and community flyering. We've created a clinical manual, a standardized clinical manual that has content and activities for parent, child, and family, so developmentally appropriate content for them. We have a 30-minute parallel session, which means that both parent and child are engaging in their own therapy with their clinicians separately first. Then they come together for a dinner or break and 45-minute conjoint session. So that's when all the families and the facilitators come together for a family-based session. So we utilize a lot of media, and so I want to show just one very quick clip on something that we might use as fodder to have conversations with parents and children. So take a quick listen to this about 15-second clip.
My parents taught me, oh, you know, cops are your friends, you're supposed to, you know, they're here to protect you, but all I'm seeing is the opposite. So how can I not be afraid when I feel like I'm being hunted? When I feel like I'm there to fill a quota?
So what we might say to the parent after such a line is, in the video, a child says he's being hunted. What has it been like as a parent to have a Black child at a time where they're feeling this way, where they're feeling hunted? And to the child, we might say, how does it feel that your parent would have to warn you about racism? So if you're feeling hunted and they're now having to warn you, like, what is that feeling like that your parent would even have to have that type of task? So that's some of the things that we might use. We use media and a number of other things to pull up the experiences that Black children are actually having so that their families can talk about it. I'm gonna show you some pilot results. I'm gonna orient you to the right side of your screen with parents here. So essentially what you're looking at is the perception of coping ability. So from a 1 to a 5, that means I can't cope very well, and this means I can cope very well, so 1 to 5. And then session number from 1 to 5, that means this is the amount of time that they're spending in Embrace. The different colors represent some various strategies that we use in managing stress. So I mentioned before, we'll come back to this acronym of CLCBE. This is what this is. So the first C is calculate. How well can you calculate how stressed you are on a scale of 1 to 10? Where is it in your body? Can you locate where that stress is building up? Can you communicate effectively what that stress is making you feel like? And then can you breathe and exhale or relax? So these are relaxation strategies. So what's really interesting is that when families first come in, they say that they can cope pretty well. So 4 out of 5 is pretty darn well. Families think that they can cope with racial stress pretty darn well. What we see in session 2 is something we hypothesize, and this is when you stress people out with something like a racial stressor. So we bring up discrimination, we talk about what it is that the families have experienced in their lives. So we're actually seeing a dip in their ability to cope, and especially with respect to relaxing. So if you think of this concept of not being able to breathe, this is a literal showing here of just how much people's ability to relax drop. So we're almost a half a point of a drop here. So that's a pretty drastic drop between session 1 and 2 of folks saying that I can cope pretty well to I can cope only moderately at that point. But what we see is that in session 3 and then 4 and 5, we return to baseline, and one might expect if something is really challenging, okay, those scores might be low, or maybe they'll go back to baseline, but that these families in sessions 4 and 5 actually outperform what they initially came in with. So their ability to cope, even when it's something as stressful as racial discrimination, and even though coping strategies tend to be avoidant, when we actually stress people out and we give them the opportunity to debrief, to unpack just how much racial stress they've been carrying, we see that there are some really exciting improvements that the parents are reporting here. With respect to what they said, a youth indicated it felt good because like we can talk about like what we've seen, so like we won't have anger built up inside of us. Another youth indicated it was exciting talking. It helped me be able to get the feelings out, because if I didn't, it would have a negative impact on your character and morals. So we have genius youth who are working with us, but this is what they said with respect to engaging. With regard to managing, a youth indicated getting to get stuff off my chest about how I feel about white people and racial experiences was helpful. And a parent noted it was empowering. It opens up like obviously a different conversation that you wouldn't typically have with your child. So for me, it was empowering because I feel like I'm teaching him like, you know, this is going to happen, but this is how you react. So this is how they're managing their stress. And then bonding, a parent noted, I wouldn't mind coming. They, the clinicians, listened to everything from me to my child, and they helped us try to communicate together. And another parent noted, prior to Embrace, I thought I was well informed about how my child thought about certain situations. Since Embrace, I now listen more and encourage more communication from my child. So again, even in challenging conversations, they are still finding opportunities to bond. We do a lot of multimedia representation in Embrace. So now you've seen data, you've heard some words from folks, but now I want you to see folks as well. So Ben, who is 13, is going to share his experience about Embrace.
Embrace helped me open up about some racial situations that actually happened to me, and it served as a support group for what I was thinking. It helped me think through what I was thinking. And it also served as a catalyst for conversations strictly about race instead of having race as the subtext of a conversation.
All right, and then Ben's mother, B.E.
Embrace helped me get to know him better and also be more open to listening instead of being in mommy mode all the time. You do this, you do that. I was challenged developing the words to have conversations about safety with law enforcement and confronting bias in the classroom. And it also helped in conversations we have here at home about our history, ancestral history, personal histories, and when talking about his future.
Okay, so we have done a pretty good job of getting our work out in the world. So we've published, we have been really fortunate to appeal to various funding agencies like the U of M Depression Center, which is helping us to put this on today. And our next stop was Detroit, which I was really excited about, but the week that we were supposed to launch was when everything shut down for COVID. So I am thankful we didn't start because I would have probably been very sad, but it's still very challenging because our community partners are really excited about this work. So our community partners are the Detroit Children's Center and the Black Family Development Incorporated. So we're thinking about processes now, like how do we make Embrace available online? How do we still have some type of programming, whether it's the full Embrace kit and caboodle or things that we've done lately, which is like just creating infographics or having community talks on Zoom so that we can engage folks. So like, how do we still take what it is that we know, this really important content that we just talked about, and still provide some community resources over time? So what, again, our desire is to directly work with families, what we're doing with Embrace, but also to better train clinicians and research staff, because we are often the ones that are challenging families in the first place with bias or with stereotypes. So it's important for us to get our lives together as well. And all of this is in service of reducing and one day eliminating discrimination as a driving force of health problems or psychological health issues with our kiddos. So that's what we have today. Please feel free to get in touch with me or the team. So this is my personal contact information, but you can also find us at the Embrace program, just about everywhere, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and also on the web. So feel free to get in touch. I'm looking forward to addressing some questions with you now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Anderson. This is the point in the program where we normally take audience questions, and we do have a number of them. It sounded like at the end there that you're still sort of working out the next steps, but I guess the first question is, if somebody wanted to participate in Embrace, is there a way that they can do that?
Yep, so you can very much contact us at the Embrace program at gmail.com, and we'd be happy to get back to you. So we're, again, seeing Black youth 10 to 14 years old. Those are the criteria right now. But if folks who don't fit that criteria still want to participate in some way, so again, we have facilitators, we have youth advisory committees, we have so many different ways of getting involved. So you can either participate in the study itself or help us to do the amazing work that we need to do. So reach out.
Okay, that's great. And to be clear, is it folks in Ann Arbor can participate, or only Detroit, or?
So again, because we're not like fully engaging it right now, it could be that this actually helps us to spread it out a bit so that folks don't have to be present. At no point would we exclude Ann Arbor folk. It's just the drive, especially like in the winter, if we were doing it at some point like that, might be a bit prohibitive. But we do hope to have some Ann Arbor attention at some point, or if we're doing it online, that would be a perfect way to get other folks involved.
Thank you. And speaking of online, I'm wondering if you have any sense of what virtual school in combination with police brutality and disproportionate effect of COVID are having on our youth right now?
Yeah, it's tough. So we've done a number of town halls this summer with youth, and it's hard because we can't get a full sense of how they're doing because we're using the same technology that's like driving them nuts in the first place, right? So I don't think anyone is happy with the day-to-day Zoom calls from 8 a.m. to you go to sleep. And then you might FaceTime somebody as a way to cope with what's going on, which is more screen time. And then you're texting. It's overwhelming for a number of people. And what I do wish that we had a better sense of was just how anxious, depressed, and stressed kiddos are. But what we've seen is that the data show a pretty clear, consistent, the younger you get, the more stressed and depressed you are. So it kind of stops at 18 for a lot of these graphs that we're looking at. But from the youth I've spoken to and from what it is that we know, youth are, sad about missing things like prom or like starting the school year. Athletes have been really, just super sad about this. So my heart goes out truly because I know how disappointed I am at so many things. And I can only imagine if I were a kiddo, how impactful this would be. But not well would be the answer that
Yeah, I'm just thinking so I'm a parent of a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old right now too. And so listening to AJ talk was just heartbreaking. And to think of how do you calmly address that as a parent when you're feeling stressed, depressed yourself, your kids are disconnected from everybody. So do you have some sort of concrete things that parents can do to have those conversations with their kids?
Yeah, and I'm happy to also provide some resources. I did a lot of media about this summer, and we've, like, through that, there have been some really good concrete steps. Let me start though by saying two things about concreteness. One is that people really want a quick fix for a very complex problem, and I'm not here to offer that today. Like, the discrimination and racism in particular, the system that lets discrimination be pervasive, is something that we have a problem with in the United States. It is entrenched in everything that we do. So I don't think that you can have such a complex problem and then say, here are the 10 steps of doing this. That's what people want, right? It's easy. It would wipe our hands of things. We'd be absolved of having to deal with this icky thing, but we have not dealt with the root. And so on the one hand, I'm actually really sad that we have embraced and that we have to hear AJ talk about these types of things, because it's not his fault and it's not our children's fault that it exists the way that it does. So let me just start by saying, on the one hand, I think it's really challenging to even have those concrete suggestions. The second thing, though, I would quickly say about the concrete nature of it is that because we're moving into this space of quality rather than quantity, I want to push people past all I have to do is say it this amount of times, or like these are the things that I have to say, and then, like, I'll be good, our family will be good. That's not what we're suggesting in our work works. It's about, how can I, as a parent, face my own demons, my own challenges? If I'm a white parent, how can I talk about that time when I was 3 and I talked about chocolate milk and my mom shushed me? How can I talk about that one guy that we saw in our house who would say these things and our parents would make us go to another room so that we didn't hear what he had to say? Like, those things happened in your childhood. How can you start to unpack that? If you're a parent of color, for example, like, how can you process the support you didn't get at a certain time, or the frustration that your parents, again, had to warn you about these things? Like, how can you deal with that stuff first? So even with all those caveats, what I do recommend is going to a mirror and practicing, talking to yourself just like you would do for a job interview or anything else where you have to prepare. You're getting it off your chest first. You're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. Or like, oh, that was actually really hard. Let me keep saying it over and over again until I feel better about it. You can also do that with your partner, whether it's a romantic partner, your life partner, a friend, whomever that partner can be. But again, that's why I always talk about the mirror, because even if you don't have a partner, you got yourself, and that works. But you can do it with a partner. A therapist is always someone who I recommend having the opportunity to do that with, if you are engaged in that self-discovery. And then other strategies of using multimedia. So there, we have a number of things that we use in Embrace, including Blackish, which is like our favorite show to do this with because they just have so many gems. But like, you have watched a show and something has sparked for you. You have watched a news report this summer and something has sparked. But there are tons of books, tons of opportunities to what we would call windows and mirrors to for children. So if you're looking at windows, these are opportunities to look through and see what it is that people are experiencing. And mirrors are opportunities to reflect back and think about for your own culture, or what it is that you see, what you're thinking about. So you're getting opportunities to go into the lives of other people and the opportunity to reflect on what it is that you have. So libraries are perfect places to engage in this content, to if it is safe to do so, to physically go, but if not, to rent or to utilize some of the media or technology that's available to show your child a different world.
Thank you. And along with those lines, we had a question of, many parents are well aware of the need to talk to preteens and teens about issues such as drugs, alcohol use, smoking, and safe sex practices. But it seems that talking to my child about race is something that doesn't come up unless there's a crisis. When should I start to talk about race with my teens? Yeah,
so this is one of my favorite questions, because a lot of people say that they should not do it until a crisis or until it's later. And so the analogy that I always use is, if your 3-year-old is already sorting out the Starburst candy in front of them, then it's time to talk about race. Like they get it like very early on. So we know that at 3 months old, there are attentional differences that infants are paying to skin color. or sound of voice for that matter. So that there are ways that we know that there are attentional differences being paid as early as 3 months. We see that manifest in 3 years. Again, this idea of like pointing out that someone must drink chocolate milk because their skin is brown. Like kids are starting to make associations with what color or what that color must represent. We have some developmental markers at like 5, 7, and 10 that really show that developmental process, that growth of how children are starting to make meaning of, see themselves in, see their own role in. By the age of 10, they're really starting to concretize that, oh, if that brown skin means bad, and if the teacher keeps expelling people that look like this, and I'm this, then. So they're starting to put together these strings of ideas very well by 10, which is why AJ, again, is such an important person who we show, because he's starting to put together systemic racism, right? And Ben, who is 13 in the video, is starting to talk about like how, systemic practices at his school has impacted his learning, his well-being. Like we're seeing this concretized understanding from starting at 10, but they are seeing it and experiencing it so much earlier than that. So there's really no excuse to broaching the subject. But what I always say, or what my mentor introduces, this idea of racial literacy. So you're not handing your child a Shakespearean novel at 3 and saying, get to reading about this really complex thing. You're introducing them through, again, age-appropriate text or age-appropriate videos. Sesame Street has some really wonderful things about this as well, but tons of age-appropriate resources that are just letting folks know color is a thing, and especially in the United States, color means something. And as they're maturating, like asking the question, this is something I forgot to say from a concrete strategy standpoint, but asking, how does it feel when you see this? What is it that you're experiencing as this is occurring? Like having those conversations where you're not the expert and even saying it. I don't know what this is. I didn't get that lesson. What would you want to tell me? Teach me, right? That's why the talk is bi-directional. That's why we want everyone to be competent in it. So it's not just you having to teach everything to your child. Ask them how it is that they're feeling.
Yeah, and how it's showing up for them. So how do I teach my child to be an ally to those who identify differently to them?
Yeah, ally is a word that's got some interesting traction this summer, and I'm blanking right now on the other word that's popping up, but essentially there are a number of ways that folks can show up for either their friends, their children's friends, et cetera. And I think the main thing that we can be doing is naming when we see something that's problematic. For so long, people have closed the door or shushed away or scolded or like really tried to sweep under this proverbial rug, this idea that race should not be discussed, that we should not have these conversations with our kids. But naming it and saying like, listen, we just had 2 police killings this weekend of unarmed Black people in the South. Like it happens again, even with scrutiny on the police force right now, we are seeing 2 incidents that happened this weekend. What does that mean? Having that conversation, what do you think that means? What should we do? Naming that, addressing this is a problem for us. At school, if there's a policy like you can't have braids or dreadlocks, right? And I don't use dreadlocks, but some schools will say like no dreadlocks, no braids. Those are problems in targeting certain groups. Can you name it? Can you then talk to a friend or colleague? Can you then take it to the school? Like how can you show up and point out this is happening? Because again, from a coping strategy standpoint, the person that it's happening to is likely to retreat or avoid. They are being harmed, actively harmed. So if we don't create some sort of like force field around them, some sort of shield that's going to protect them from what's going on, that might really harm them in ways that are going to be hard to recover from. So if you can intervene, if you can get between that discrimination and that outcome and say, not today, not my school, not this police force, not any of these things that are plaguing people who I consider my brother, I consider my sister, I consider my family member. These are people in our community that I love and care about, and it's not going to happen on my watch.
And so it sounds like really being proactive and modeling and doing the work. Because the next question that we had was, given all of that's going on, how do I protect my Black and brown son from emotional harm and mental stress? And it sounds like some of the strategies could be the same, whether you're an ally or a parent of a Black and brown child.
Absolutely. I think I love AJ's story, and I probably have to stop using him soon because he's going to be an adult and he's going to be like stop showing this, video of me as a kiddo. But he went on to say that we ask, who do you talk to about this when you're feeling hurt? And he says, nobody. I'm in the room with the TV by myself when I see these things or when I hear these things. Having family conversations about this and asking, how did it feel? What are you noticing? Those are, if you think of the metaphor of, a tea kettle, or if you're in the state of Michigan, pop, and you have, something that's highly carbonated or shaken up, these are explosive or like bubbling things happening under the surface. And if we continue to keep it bubbled, what we're learning, again, from an internalizing standpoint, is that it erodes, or from an externalizing standpoint is that it will explode. So it will either erode or explode at some point. So what it is that we're asking you to do is just take the top off a little bit, just pull the lid up a bit and start to ask those questions, so that eventually the water might still be hot, or the conditions might still be shaken for these youth, but they'll know that their bodies will know what to do and what to make of that environment.
So having those conversations can, I imagine, be anxiety producing. Why is sort of processing discomfort around race and racism a crucial part of parenting? And do you have any tips for dealing with the anxiety during these difficult conversations that parents may be having?
So I want to make sure that I'm getting this, because it was two pieces. I think I got the second. Can you ask the first one more time?
The first is sort of like, why is like sort of processing your discomfort important in sort of preparing for these conversations? And then how might I deal with that anxiety when I'm preparing to have the conversation?
Yeah, so if we go back to the that first kind of model that I showed you that has that indirect pathway, so what happens to a parent is going to potentially lead to their own depression, their own parenting practices, and then the child. There are tons of processes that are happening within the family, within the parent themselves, that if you're not unpacking what it is that you are feeling, and especially if a child is watching you lament or get frustrated or whatever the expression that it is that you're having, and then you're not explaining to them what's going on, you may essentially be double, what am I trying to say? Like, that's not a good word. You might be hitting your child in two ways with the challenges here, because they're already seeing the discrimination happening in the world, but then they're seeing you and they don't know how to process what it is that you're experiencing because you're not telling them about it. So you dealing with your own self not only helps your child to make better sense and better meaning of it, but you're, healing yourself. You're able to address your depression, your anxiety in a way that you as an individual deserve, you as a human deserve. We often see parents as parents, and that's it. They're a mother, they're a father, period. You are a human, you're deserving of healing, health, wholeness, etc. So you deserve it first and foremost, and then your child needs to see that as well. And now I've lost the second question, Stephanie, gosh darn it.
Just some tools for managing the anxiety of having difficult conversations.
Talk in the mirror, talk to your friends,
yeah.
And talk to a therapist or a partner. We're here for you.
Okay. And I think the one thing, I know we're running a little bit short on time here, but I think it's really important question what are some ways for me to know when my child or teen is in need of additional support? What signs should I be looking for?
Yeah, it's tough. And to go back to another question that you asked, like this is a unique time. So, sleeping more, some of the things that we would say, like, this is what classic depression is: sleeping more, eating erratically, not, expressing yourself. That could be Zoom fatigue. That could be like, we're in a global pandemic, I just don't feel like talking. Like, we know that people are not doing well in this time. So some of the things that we would be looking for may not exist for indicators right now. So to me, I think a really important element is using a check-in, like whether it's once a week, once a day, like if you all are eating a meal together, if there are notes, whatever way that you're getting some sort of check-in. How are you doing today? And you know good and well your teen is going to say fine. And then you know you have to probe a bit more, like what does fine mean today? I always talk about data. So you're getting data. What was the baseline? So if we're talking about last week, are they doing better or worse than that? Have you tried to facilitate maybe like a socially distant group, meeting in a park, or maybe on your if you have a porch, something that will allow your children to still utilize their social support system in a time where it can be really challenging to be isolated, especially in the summer where you would look forward to doing stuff like that. So getting some data, get a same baseline, trying to facilitate social support services for your child. And again, if it does look like, all right, even though we can't really use sleeping and eating and all these things as a criteria now, because virtually everyone is kind of off their norm for that. If I am noticing a long period of that, if you want to perhaps look at some of the classic signs of depression and anxiety online, but again, sleeping, eating, lethargy, not wanting to do pretty basic activities that they used to find enjoyable. Those are some of the key markers. And you might say, wow, this is now stretched on from what I would think would be normal in a global pandemic. Again, challenging to say, but it was stretched on now from May, from April, right? It's now in month 3 or 4. I think it's time for me to call up someone like me or my staff with the Embrace program, or U of M Depression Center, or a number of people who are here to support your child in this time.
Thank you so much. And I'm hoping that maybe the library will have the links with this recording too, but I will just underscore of checking out the Embrace website, and then the Depression Center at depressioncenter.org. There's a number of resources available to both online and in person, and there's a number of like virtual support groups for families that are available at no cost and things like that. So I'd recommend folks check that out. Did you have any last words or anything?
I really hope that you are well, that you and yours are well, and that during this time you are giving yourself grace and just understanding we are all doing the best that we can to survive. So be grateful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. We appreciate your time. And thank you to the Ann Arbor Library.